Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to speak today on Bill C-12, legislation that will create transparency and accountability in Canada's efforts to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. Madam Speaker, climate change is without doubt one of the greatest challenges of the 21st century. It is literally an existential crisis. This House has already recognized this when, spurred by the likes of Greta Thunberg in Sweden and so many environmental advocates right here in Canada, we passed a motion in June of 2019 declaring a climate emergency. But now it is critical to act, and act quickly, on the science that is all around us. If the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it is that public policy, be it in relation to health, be it in relation to the environment, must always be informed by evidence and based on science. That science is unequivocal, Madam Speaker. Bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tell us that climate change is real, it is happening all around us, and if we, as national governments, don't act decisively, the damage will be irreversible. That is exactly why we must act now, Madam Speaker, for our children, for our grandchildren, for the future of this country, and indeed is not hyperbolic to say for the future of this planet. In fact, my view, Madam Speaker, is that Canadians of all ages are actually ahead of us on climate action and climate activism. We saw this clearly when tens of thousands of Canadians took to the streets in September of 2019 to participate in climate marches and demonstrations right around the country. We saw this again when Canadians went to the polls in the last federal election in October 2019, returning our government to power based on a commitment to a more sustainable and greener future, a commitment where we stated we would not only meet but exceed Canada's 2030 emissions reduction goals while setting legally binding 5-year milestones to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Today it is an important day, Madam Speaker. This debate is an important debate because in tabling and debating Bill C-12, we're fulfilling that important campaign commitment. And we know how important this issue is to Canadians across the country. I personally, as the Member of Parliament for Parkdale High Park, know how important this issue is to my constituents, the individuals and groups that speak to me constantly about the urgency of acting on climate change. Groups like PHP for Climate Action, Green 13, Green Parkdale, Green a City, Roncy Reduces, Bloor West Reduces, Humberside Heat, and Eco Schools Canada are just a sample of the groups that are vocal about this issue and are advocating on this issue. Groups that want not only a net zero emissions future, but groups that are already taking concrete steps now to change their behavior and model best practices for others. It is through these types of community-led grassroots initiatives I know that we can together build back better and greener coming out of this pandemic. And I thank these community leaders for all of their advocacy and for always prompting and pushing for even greater ambition on climate change. And I'll say to you, Madam Speaker, when I had the opportunity to go to COP24 in Katowice, Poland, prior to attending that climate change conference hosted by the UN, I consulted these leaders, asked for their input and advice about the issues to focus in on during my time at COP, and that help and expertise was invaluable. Madam Speaker, let me turn now to Bill C-12 and how it fits into the broader plan to tackle climate change. This historic piece of legislation will help us meet our net zero greenhouse gas emissions target by 2020 by imposing a legally binding process for the federal government. Concretely, this means that this government and every future government, regardless of political affiliation, once the bill is passed, will be held accountable when it comes to lowering our greenhouse gas emissions in order to do our part in reaching the overall goal of net zero by 2050. This type of legislation will be pivotal to put us on the path to meet the overall objective identified in the Paris Agreement, which has been spoken about on many occasions during the course of today's debate. The goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We have to reach these targets, Madam Speaker. The stakes of not doing so are simply too high. Again, not just for this country, but for all countries. To meet the 2050 objective, and that's an objective that I would note, parenthetically, has been agreed to by 120 different nation states around the planet. But in order to do so here, what we're proposing with this legislation is establishing clear milestones to ensure that we are making continued and steady progress. Bill C-12 ensures that the 5-year targets will be set. A progress report and an assessment report will be required for each step. By doing this, we are putting clear measures in place to ensure that the fight against climate change is prioritized and addressed in a transparent manner. We're making sure that if a future government misses a 5-year target, it will be held accountable for it by assessing its failure and by putting in place a plan to meet its shortfall. There will be no excuses, Madam Speaker. The report will explicitly need to mention the reasons why the federal government failed to meet the target, a description of the actions that the government is planning to undertake in order to address the failure, and any other relevant information the Minister wishes to include. Further, C-12 also contemplates an advisory body composed of 15 members that will be created in order to assist the Minister of the Environment in achieving net zero emissions by 2050. It will be consulting and engaging with experts, stakeholders, Indigenous peoples, and the public. Based on these consultations, the advisory body will be providing advice to government on how to meet its targets. This is an important measure to keep the Government of Canada focused and on track when it comes to reducing emissions and formulating policy that is informed by science and expertise, as I outlined earlier. Finally, Madam Speaker, Bill C-12 will require the Minister of Finance to publish an annual report in which she explains how the financial risks and opportunities associated with climate change are being considered by departments and Crown corporations in their decision-making process. Madam Speaker, let's turn to this issue about milestone years and targets. It's something that's been raised by commentators, something that's been raised on the floor of this chamber during the context of this debate. Concerns have been raised, namely that the first 5-year cycle under Bill C-12 commences in 2025, with the first milestone year being 2030. This begs the question as to what transpires between now and 2025 under this legislative model. When I reflected on this myself and looked back at the bill, I noted a couple of important points. First is that within 6 months of this act coming into force, so hypothetically we could be seeing passage of this legislation if Parliament undertook the scrutiny required, and you could have within 6 months of passage, potentially in the fall of 2021, a tabling about the milestone plan and the target. Secondly, the Act stipulates that within 5 years of coming into force, again, potentially 5 years from spring of next year, the Commissioner of the Environment, in conjunction with the Auditor General, would examine and report on the Government of Canada's implementation of measures aimed at mitigating climate change. We've also heard a lot about these progress reports. I mentioned them myself earlier in my comments, Madam Speaker. A progress report must be tabled, and they will form part of the government's scrutiny and the scrutiny of all future levels of government. The frequency of these types of progress reports is important. That shouldn't be understated. What I would say is that if we were to have a current progress report, looking back on what we've accomplished as a Liberal government since we came to power in 2015, I would posit, Madam Speaker, that progress report would be extensive. And why do I say that, Madam Speaker? Because no federal government has done more to fight climate change than the current federal Liberal government. Our very first action in 2015 was to participate in the Paris Conference. With 194 parties, we also signed on to and led the Paris Agreement, which was signed shortly after. As soon as we came into office, we decided to unmuzzle scientists. That prompted one Globe and Mail reporter to cite, and this is Mark Hume, he stated, and I quote, "The Conservatives wanted tight control on the message and didn't trust their own experts to be experts. That's all changed now. Mr. Trudeau has unmuzzled the scientists," end quote. Madam Speaker, in 2018, we championed the development of an ocean plastics charter following the G7 ministerial meeting on climate change. This charter, now endorsed by 25 governments and 60 businesses and organizations worldwide, aims to keep our oceans free from plastics. In 2018, we put a price on carbon pollution, Madam Speaker. This concrete action is a pillar of our approach to climate action. It applies to individuals, it applies to industry. The current price on carbon is $30 per tonne. By 2022, it will rise to $50 per tonne, as will the Climate Action Incentive Rebate, which allows Canadians the opportunity to take those dollars and invest in greener alternatives in their everyday lives. By putting a price on pollution, we are clearly contributing to lowering emissions. On October 7th of this year, the Minister of the Environment provided more details on our plan to ban single harmful use plastics. This is an ambitious step towards getting towards zero plastic waste. Madam Speaker, what's important to underline, and in my final comment, what I will indicate is that we also believe fundamentally that the economy and the environment are not dichotomous. This is a false presentation put forward most frequently by the members of the official opposition. The single thing I will point you to is something that's already been raised in the context of today's debate. Battery emission vehicles, zero emitting vehicles, we are funding those. Plants are being opened in Oakville and in Windsor by Fiat and by Ford to do just that, to embrace a just transition, to show that you can actually build towards a sustainable future and keep people employed at the same time. This bill is part of that broader suite of approaches. It is a critical bill for this generation, for future generations, and is one that I dearly hope that all parliamentarians can get behind. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Merci beaucoup.